Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's live discussion on Benjamin Park Historian, the YouTube channel. I am thrilled to be coming to you again after a very momentous month. We passed a few milestones on this channel that I'm quite thrilled about. We are most importantly, we passed our year mark. I still can't believe that I've been doing this for over 12 months now. And I want to take a moment to thank Anthony Ambrose, the wonderful producer, the person doing all the work behind the scenes and making this possible. He was the one that convinced me to do this YouTube channel in the first place. So if you have any beef with me, you can take it up with him. And in that year, I've been very grateful that we are approaching 14,000 subscribers. If you're not subscribed to this channel, please remedy that right now. You can click the subscribe button on this very page. And while you're there, please hit the like button so that we can get more people joining into this video. We had a very eventful month. I'll get to the videos on the battles over Mormon history in just a bit, but we had some wonderful, from my perspective, I was quite proud of them. We had videos on Book of Mormon geography theories. We had, and if you want a sense of the vibrant debate that's still going on about where the Book of Mormon took place, you can go find them in the comments of that video. Because there you get the Baja California theory, you get the Africa theory that the Book of Mormon actually took place in Africa. You get, and of course, plenty of the Heartlander theories appear in there as well. I did a video on a new book on Latino Mormons and their culture. I did a deep dive on Wilford Woodruff's vision of the Founding Fathers, complicating the narrative, looking at the story behind it and the context on which it took place. I did a video on the polarization of American religion, in which I interviewed the top demographer and survey taker on American religion, Ryan Burge, who teaches at the University of Washington in St. Louis at the Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. And I did a historical context for how Mormons view the Constitution that hopefully gives some understanding to the church's approach to the semi-quincentennial this year, the 250th anniversary of America's founding. I have some great videos coming up in the next few weeks and that I'm really excited for all of you to see on topics that mean a lot to me. This Friday, I have a video on Joseph Smith's evolving notion of God and the Godhood. Part of my So You Want to Know More About series, where I introduce you to the documents as well as the historiographical arguments so that you can get the material necessary to come to your own conclusion on how Joseph Smith evolved in his teachings, or did he evolve at all? And that's coming this Friday. On this coming Monday, I have a deep dive on Joseph Smith's use of habeas corpus in Nauvoo, which may sound boring. Anytime you invoke Latin, right, and law, it might sound boring. But I promise you, habeas corpus is the most important element about Nauvoo that led to his death at Carthage jail that you don't really know about. So look forward to that next Monday. And in the coming weeks, I have a history of the Sunday school that should hopefully give some light to recent changes that the church announced, to a fascinating new article that talks about these Mormon supposedly monogamous women who forged relationships with American activists in the early 20th century, putting on a modern face of Mormonism, who are actually all secretly sealed to plural marriages. And it's really, really fascinating. I'm excited for that. I have a deep dive on Denver Snuffer coming up if you want to know more about the Snuffer movement. And I also have a fascinating story on someone who broke into the Salt Lake City temple in 1911, took photographs, and then tried to blackmail the church with it. Something that was a crisis to church leaders, but they ended up spinning to a PR win, and it resulted in one of the most important texts published in Mormon history. I see a comment. I did a great variety of videos this last month. Thank you so much. That's what I aim to do, and I hope that variety will continue. But also this last month, I did a 5-video series on the battles over Mormon history in the 1970s and 1980s. I argued that Mormonism really reckoned with its historical conscience, meaning its identity of itself in those decades. Now, of course, there were precursors, important historians before that time, Fawn Brodie with No Man Knows My History, Juanita Brooks with her Massacre at Mountain Meadows book, and then you have Leonard Arrington coming to the prominence as one of Mormonism's leading historians. And then in 1972, Leonard Arrington gets appointed as the church historian. And there's an interesting backstory on why that happens and why the church would allow an academic historian to take control of its historical department. And it ends up turning out poorly because other leaders were upset with the type of history that was being produced by Arrington and those within what we called Camelot. So I touched on several of these important case studies over the next 2 decades. I talked about one of Leonard Arrington's historians, Reed Durham, who delivered his presidential address at the Mormon History Association annual conference in 1974 that proved so controversial because he demonstrated the connections of Masonry to Mormonism, and especially the Mormon endowment rituals, that he was forced to issue a public apology and statement of faith, and then he had to recede from public scholarship, a huge loss for our field. So I talk about that fascinating saga and what it tells us. I talked about fights over B.H. Roberts' belief over the Book of Mormon in the 1980s. Even though Roberts had been dead for 50 years, there were discovered these manuscripts he wrote later in life that seemed to poke holes in traditional Orthodox defenses and apologetics of the Book of Mormon. So I talk about those sources and how they can be interpreted. I did a deep dive on the Mark Hofmann forgeries and bombings, the most requested video ever since I've started. So I hope you enjoyed that. I did a video on D. Michael Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic World View, which was one of the results of the Mark Hofmann saga. And then I also talked about a feminist biography of Emma Smith, Mormon Enigma by Val Avery and Linda Newell, and a book that proved so controversial that they were banned from speaking in church settings for nearly a year. So I could have done lots more topics, but those are the 5 I chose. So I'm going to get to the Q&A in just a minute. So feel free to start leaving comments and I'll get to them. But I wanted to start with one final anecdote. If I were doing one more video, and I may do this video in the future, I would tell the story of D. Michael Quinn versus the Apostles, the backstory to this Newsweek story, Apostles versus Historian. And yes, that is a young D. Michael Quinn coming to ideological blows. And the backstory was this. Boyd K. Packer was assigned to speak to LDS Church educators on August 22nd, 1981. And in his address, this is 9 years after Arrington was appointed church historian, we've had nearly a decade of these battles between historians and apostles and church leaders. And Boyd K. Packer was ready to throw down the gauntlet. So he chose as his topic, the title was "The Mantle is Far, Far Greater Than the Intellect." And in his address, he critiqued these secular historians for raising difficult issues and overlooking the hand of God in history. Rather than judge the church by academic standards, he told them, you should be judging Academy by the light of the Restoration. And perhaps 2 of the most prominent quotes that end up being talking points going on is he said that when people read the history of the church, they should, quote, see in every hour and in every moment of the existence of the church from its beginning until now, the overruling mighty hand of him who sent his only begotten son. And if we lose this principle, we may lose our way in the world of intellectual and scholarly research. And then it's in that context that Packer gave his famous statement, some things that are true are not very useful. Now, a professor at BYU at the time was D. Michael Quinn. D. Michael Quinn had only been teaching at BYU for 4 years by that point. He had worked in Leonard Arrington's Camelot back in the 1970s. Then he left to Yale to get his PhD, and then he came back to BYU to teach in the history department. He was not the D. Michael Quinn that you know of yet. He had yet to publish a major book. He had published a few really smart articles, but he was still paving his way. And this ended up being one of the first crucial clashes between him and church leadership. So he was invited by Phi Alpha Theta, which was an honor society for historians and history students at BYU that Phi Alpha Theta is found across the nation. It's the oldest honor society of historians, to address and talk about it. So he gave an address titled On Being a Mormon Historian. And there's a few things that I want to highlight about the address. You can find this address if you just Google it online, by the way. Most importantly, he began the address by bearing his testimony, which is something that might startle some people, though if you are familiar with his works, it might not come as a surprise because he often bore his testimony in scholarly works. He did so in Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, for instance. And then he went on, however, to emphasize that historians must play by the rules of history, balancing both faith and the intellect. The same balance that Boyd K. Packer had spoken about, but much of a different direction. And this is what he said. Therefore, the Mormon historian has both a religious and a professional obligation not to conceal the ambivalence, debate, give and take, uncertainty, and simple pragmatism that often attend decisions of the prophet and first presidency, and not to conceal the limitations, errors, and negative consequences of some significant statements of the prophet and first presidency. In like manner, however, the Mormon historian would be equally false if he failed to report on the inspiration, visions, revelation, and solemn testimonies that have also attended prophetic decisions and statements throughout Mormon history. So you see, he's emphasizing we need to see the faults of the history, and we need to see the divine nature. Now, when he delivered that address, I'll go ahead and remove this from this scene. When he gave that address to BYU students, there were only about 40 to 50 people in attendance, and he expected it not to have much ramification. However, some students who had just created an alternative press, Seventh East Press, published the entirety of his remarks, and it ended up being big news. So much so that it was picked up by Newsweek, which is that story that I showed a screenshot earlier of apostles versus historians. And Quinn was actually called to Salt Lake City to meet with Gordon B. Hinckley, who had just been added to the first presidency, and defend himself. And he explained that, yeah, there are some parts of history that do not mesh with the historical world. And we, as historians, we need to unpack those differences. And he uses as an example, post-manifesto polygamy. And he says that Gordon B. Hinckley was shocked when he found out the real history of post-manifesto polygamy in that meeting. And that was the origins of Quinn eventually publishing his post-manifesto polygamy article in Dialogue. So that's just such a fascinating story, and it embodies so many of the tensions of these battles over Mormon history during the 1970s and 80s, because you get questions of ecclesiastical oversight, the push for free inquiry, the naturalistic history versus spirit-filled history, and of course, Quinn would eventually become excommunicated in part due to his scholarship. All right, so that's all my preparatory remarks. So hopefully we can get to some of your questions, and I'll go 60 to 90 minutes, depending on how many questions come in. But again, I'm so grateful for so many of you have come up and are so interested in geeking out with me. So from Ron Deuce 1194, have you read Polly Aird's book, Mormon Convert, Mormon Defector? It's well researched. I agree. This was actually one of the first books that I reviewed for an academic journal. I can't remember what academic journal I reviewed it for, but I reviewed it and I loved it. It's such a fascinating story. So Polly Aird is not a Latter-day Saint, but she has, I can't remember if she was raised Latter-day Saint or maybe it was her family, but she definitely has ancestors. And so she wanted to investigate her ancestor, Thomas McCloskton, or I'm probably butchering the name, but it was a Scottish ancestor who converted to Mormonism, traveled to Utah, and then left Mormonism. And then, so she is able to unpack the story that kind of shows the power of historical research, because her ancestor did not leave any research on his own. He did not leave a memoir. But what we do have is sources around that figure. And that's what Polly Aird was able to use. So it's very much like creating a picture out of a negative, right? Painting all around this individual to understand that individual's life. And it's a very powerful historical work as a result. So I strongly recommend Polly Aird's Mormon Convert, Mormon Defector. All right. So more questions coming in. By the way, please hit the like button if you haven't yet, and please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that yet. Is Valet Kimball pronounced Valet or Violet? Great question. I have heard many historians debate this. I heard that I thought the family pronounced it Valet. But then I talked to someone who actually studies genealogy and this linguistics, and who said that there's no way on earth they would have pronounced it Valet. It would have been something closer to Violet. So I honestly have no idea. I typically go by Valet because that's what I've heard some family members refer to it, but I could be absolutely wrong. All right. From Nathan, how does the Mark Hofmann episode affect confidence in the veracity of historical documents in general? How do we know if there aren't documents that got away with it? Such a great question. And one that I wish I would have had more time to get into in my video on Hoffman. I think what's important to note is the Hoffman saga was a wake-up moment for many historians, that when trying to affirm the veracity of documents, it's not enough just to place them in context. It's not enough to do handwriting and whatnot. There really has to be an emphasis on provenance. And for what I understand, those who worked in the church history archives really took the lesson of Hoffman and realized that we have to do better at tracing the provenance of documents. And provenance has to be the core criteria we use when defining whether a document is legitimate or not. And so the question is, are there still some documents? Yeah, there are. There's actually a file of these documents that the church is not 100% sure, because they might not have come in through Hoffman, but Hoffman was involved in some way, because Hoffman was so smart in how he handled documents. He wasn't always a seller. He sometimes used intermediaries. Sometimes he'd sell to someone who would sell to the church. And so the church did a lot more of making sure we can trace the provenance back to know the chain of custody in various documents. So right now, I think there is a good sense that we are well aware of what the Hoffman documents are. But every once in a while, there's some document that crops up or not. I think just a couple decades ago, when Rick Turley, Ron Walker, and Glenn Leonard were publishing their Mountain Meadows Massacre book, they discovered another Hoffman forgery that was a Mountain Meadows Massacre related document that they started investigating. And they're like, wait, how did we get this document? What's the chain of custody here? And then they realized that, no, this came in through similar ways that other Hoffman forgeries did. And so they ended up, announcing it to the world. And I think the church has actually been really good at clarifying which documents we can't verify the provenance of and which ones we can feel confident of. All right. Feel free to keep putting in comments. I don't see that many so far. Are there any 1800s Mark Hofmanns that we know of, forgers or forgeries from earlier eras of church history? I can't think of any. It kind of rings a bell to where I vaguely remember some forgers in the 19th, but none that had lots of provenance or prominence or received lots of attention. I think there were plenty of forgers for religious history in general. In fact, there is a book published by Deseret Book recently about women in early Christianity that came out by I won't out this BYU religion professor, that came out, and experts in the field were like, actually, that document's a forgery. And so that's one case in which Mormons didn't create the forgery, but in the end, they, ended up following it. And so I think the question of finding similar forgeries is hard. I will note that there is one other example of someone who at least claimed or was nearly a forger in recent history, when Val Avery and Linda Newell were working on Mormon Enigma, the biography of Emma Smith. They were contacted by a woman who lived out in the Midwest who claimed that she was a descendant of Emma Smith, and she had Emma Smith's diaries. And they extended a long conversation. The church got involved about purchasing it. And then finally, she came out and confessed that she didn't have the documents. There were some suspecting that she might have tried to forge some for money and just chickened out. I mean, what Mark Hofmann did is a lot harder than it appears, but that was one case to where they thought there might be some new documents, and it turns out it was all fake. The forgery part is interesting. I wonder how many times it's happened throughout all faiths. I bet it's a lot. Yeah, it is quite a lot. People know how to take advantage of religious groups. And for good or ill, religious groups are often seen as marks who can give in to these types of documents. And these conniving individuals can speak to their concerns. And they often follow a similar pattern of Mark Hofmann. Remember, Mark Hofmann, his earliest forgeries were faith-affirming to the LDS Church. That's how he built his cachet. It wasn't until after he had that foundation that he started doing the Salamander letter and the Joseph Smith III document and the Josiah Stoll document, the documents that challenged Mormon faith. So I think you see this pattern that Hoffman followed that is replicated in many religious traditions. Notably, a pattern that the Stephen Colbert character followed himself in the Law and Order criminal intent episode that I mentioned at the end of the Mark Hofmann video. What do you think about the Saints books? I've heard it's history for people who don't like history. That's actually a good way to put it. So let me say from the outset, I think the Saints books are good. They're really good historians behind them. I think they had access to lots of sources. And I think their approach was leagues better than previous correlated histories. So I want to get that message clear, because now I'm going to nitpick. Because we need to understand a lot of people who know history, who are history nerds. And if you're tuning into this, you're likely a history nerd. History nerds will likely approach these books and feel dissatisfied or feel a bit empty. And that's because these books, as that comment wisely said, are not really meant for people who are into history. They are meant for people with a 10th grade education who do not have background in history and are written in a way that are easily translated into dozens of languages. They also, by the way, have to meet a faithful narrative that can be approved by the LDS Church and its leaders. So those are very clear circumstances, boundaries that are going to shape how those books are structured. And with those boundaries, with those rules in place, I think they did about as good as possible. And I think it's important to remember that they're real historians, and you can see the differences that they take. Because you look at the Joseph Smith Papers volumes, this side of me. The Joseph Smith Papers volumes are top-rate scholarship. They're coming out of the same departments that produce the Saints volumes, but they are directed to scholars. That's one of the best things that happened in the Joseph Smith Papers series, was Gordon B. Hinckley told them, you need to write these for scholars. The authors of Saints were directly instructed to write these for Latter-day Saints who don't like history. So if you're interested in academic history, if you're well-read in history, you're probably not going to be that interested. Although I will note, there are sections in the Saints volumes that I think are phenomenal and actually engage some fascinating things. I'll give some examples. I think they deal with the years immediately following the 1890 manifesto phenomenally well. I think they're able to engage those histories with sources in ways that really captures the drama of the moment. There are other portions of the histories that I will admit I was a bit frustrated with. I thought the first volume was a bit Joseph Smith centered. I was surprised by how much these histories that otherwise are very much democratized and focused on lots of voices who aren't in the hierarchy. I thought the first volume was very much focused on Joseph Smith more than I assumed. And further, I was a bit frustrated by some of the defensive postures they took on Joseph Smith, including polygamy, especially dealing with John C. Bennett. And those issues. And maybe that was just me setting my expectations too high. But that's some general takeaways from the Saints volume. So in general, I think they did phenomenally well. given the strict parameters of that project. All right, Sister Mother Superior, great name. Thank you for all the work you do. I greatly appreciate your scholarship and the scholarship of others that you make accessible to us, digesting in your carefully prepared and summarized marks. Thanks. I love to hear that. That's what I aim to do. This channel is designed, I hope, to bridge the academic and public worlds. And one of the ways I try to do that is talking about other scholarship and bringing in scholars to talk about their scholarship. So I really appreciate that. How open are the church archives to researchers today? Are there known documents of interest that they do not allow anyone to access? I will say the archives are more open now than they've probably ever been, even surpassing the Camelot era of the 1970s. That said, there are still restrictions. They still follow the policy of sacred, secret, and confidential. So if it's sacred materials, especially those related to the temple, they're going to not allow access, or they're going to black them out if they digitize and have microfilm. Secret, if it's material that they fear is private, then they're not going to share that as well. And then confidential is, disciplinary records, things that they feel does not serve the public use. Now, I might quibble with how they define those categories, but I think it's fair to say that those categories are quite standard across many institutions. When it comes to 19th century history, I can probably only think of a handful of documents that I would love access to, but I've not yet gained access to. One of them is going to be solved soon, the Diaries of William Clayton. Those are in the long publication process at Yale University Press. It's out of the hands of the church historians at this point. It's just the slow mechanisms of university press publishing, but that's going to be published soon. And so that'll be a big thing. I really wish I could have access to the Council of 50 records in early Utah, when the Council of 50 served as the quasi-government for the Utah territory. Those aren't accessible yet, and I find that unfortunate. There are some temple-related documents that we don't have access to. One historian said that he once discovered in a letterpress volume the original temple liturgy of Nauvoo, the endowment as it was practiced then. Boy, I would love to see that. No one else has been able to see that, but that's supposedly somewhere. But then we get into 20th century, and it used to be a lot more spotty. This idea that these records in the 20th century are too close to the present. We don't want to give access to them. And so some were made available and some weren't. And then thankfully, 2 years ago, I think I'm getting my dates right, the church announced a formalized policy that the records of church leaders, both women and men, will be made fully available 70 years after the person's death. And that number is somewhat common in the archival industry, because that means that any individual who's mentioned in that record is likely dead by the time it's available, so they don't have to get permission from that person to, air out their information, and there's no threats of lawsuits. And so I wish that was not 70 years. I wish it was 25 years, which is also a common number. But that means that we now have access to James Talmage's records. We have access to Heber J. Grant's records and lots of other records that we didn't have access to before. I will say one final note on archival access. The sources I really wish we could have access to are the survey data that the church gathers on congregations and stakes across the world. Those surveys that they send out asking, how often do you attend church? How often do you read the scriptures? How do you pray? What are your beliefs on this or that value? That is probably the richest documentary record of religious life, of lived religion in modern America. And scholars are probably never going to be able to see that, which I find unfortunate. So I really wish we had access, but that's the modern stuff, though. There's no way they're going to make that available. Do you know of any other artifacts, assets, documents that the Community of Christ has that the LDS Church would be interested in purchasing outside of the Joseph, Emma, Hiram grave sites? That's a great question. Artifacts, assets, documents. I don't think so. I think the Smith family grave sites are would be great in the LDS Church's eyes, but I think they know that that is Communion of Christ property. The Communion of Christ is the Smith family church. And that has more than just, Joseph and Emma and Hiram. It has other members of the Smith family, including other, people who were in what was then the RLDS church. So I don't think there's any reason they want that. I guess maybe some of the portraits, there are, the famous Joseph and Emma portraits from Nauvoo. Maybe the church would like those, but the Communion of Christ basically gave up all documents, assets, and sites that would be of any interest to the LDS Church. So I can't think of any more. What is the LDS Church's explanation for how Hinckley and other apostles were able to be so easily deceived by Hoffman? How does this not put the lie to their claim of holy inspiration? So in the Netflix series Murder Among the Mormons, which is really, really good. I thought that was a wonderfully done documentary, even if it was more in the true crime genre rather than the historical genre that I, as an over-specialized history nerd, would have followed. They let Rick Turley answer that question. Now, I'm not going to come down on whether this is a viable answer or not, or if it's persuasive. That's above my pay grade, and that's going to be decided according to different people and their faith commitments and whatnot. But the way Rick Turley answered it was he said that God gives agency. And just because a prophet or apostle has divine inspiration and lots of other elements, that does not mean that they can be guided in everything. And so having God or Jesus Christ specifically speak out on this would be usurping their necessity of finding things out on their own. That said, there were plenty of people, of course, who viewed how they were duped by Mark Hofmann and said this is evidence that they're not prophets, seer, and revelators. They were at that table. There's a famous picture of Mark Hofmann and Spencer W. Kimball and Gordon B. Hinckley looking at the document. Why didn't they have the prick of the Holy Ghost? I mean, that complicates, at the very least, it complicates the very fundamentalist assumption that prophets are always inspired, right? But the faithful response to that, the apologetic response, is that agency is a crucial element, and leaders and members alike have to prove themselves sometimes on their own wit. So whether you find that convincing or not, that's your question. With so much historical information about the church easily available online today, why do you think many active Latter-day Saints don't engage deeply with it? And what factors shape what to trust? So that's a great question. For a start, I will say that there are many Latter-day Saints who engage this information online. And I always emphasize that there are people who know more about history than me and are better scholars than I am, who are still devout believers. And so just the level of attaining knowledge is not a certain designation of your level of faith. And of course, there are plenty who are better historians than me and know more than me who have left the faith over these types of issues. So it really is, there are lots of elements that go into someone's belief. Belief is fundamentally irrational. That's just what religion is. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's explicit. So the smart question that you ask is, why don't more people actually engage in this? For a lot of people, they have lives in their minds. So I don't want to say that to kind of, dismiss that digging into stuff doesn't mean you have a life. I dig into this stuff all the time, right? And I'd like to think I have a life. But lots of people just have different interests. Many people follow their interests into other ways. And the only thing that matters to them are faith considerations, these roots of spiritual expressions that are always going to take a precedence over other things. And also there's lots of great TV on, so maybe that's distracting. Just tuning in, love your videos. Thank you, Darth Momo. Do you think the LDS leaders thought the salamander later was real? The Netflix doc make them seem kind of skeptical. Gordon B. Hinckley was somewhat skeptical, but he was willing to trust the historians, which is actually an important measure to put in here, that it wasn't just church leaders who were duped by Hoffman. It was the best historians of the era. Dean Jesse, who knows more about Joseph Smith's handwriting than anyone else will ever learn. He was duped. So I think it's fair to say that church leaders, they probably didn't want it to be real, right? They wanted it to be fake, but they were willing to listen to their historians. I've actually heard this invoked by some people saying that church leaders should not listen to historians. Look where it got them with the Mark Hofmann saga. And I really hope that's not the main takeaway of that episode. But I think that they were somewhat skeptical, but it would be overstating things to say that they felt vindicated when it proved to be a forgery. I think they were willing to accept those documents based on the historical record. And at the very least, they did not have strong premonitions, or at least they didn't make it clear strong premonitions that they thought it was fake. There's a Netflix doc. Yes, that's Murder Among the Mormons. It's on Netflix. It's a 3-part series. It is really well done. It's done by Jared Hess of Napoleon Dynamite fame, and Tyler Meekum, I think, is the name of the other director. They included a lot of great historians who provided background information. I'll share one of my favorite background stories that I learned when they spoke at Mormon History Association a few years ago about the documentary. This was the last real scholarly project that D. Michael Quinn was involved in. And so they interviewed D. Michael Quinn, and they would ask him a question, and then he would go off for 30 minutes on the various topic. And they would come back and say, can you say that again in 30 seconds? And he's like, I'll try. And then he gave a 15-minute presentation. They're like, oh, but we really need 30 seconds as a soundbite. And he just never could be succinct. If you know Mike, I mean, you've seen his footnotes. If you know Mike Quinn, that doesn't surprise you. But that's sadly why Mike Quinn does not belong in the documentary, although they said they have these hours of footage with him that hopefully they'll make available at some point. They were supposed to put it up on a website, but I haven't seen them do that yet. If I'm wrong, you can go correct me and put in the links. The Stephen Colbert episode got my son interested in church history. He finally decided too many lies. Yeah, I wonder how many stories, like Stephen Colbert might find it funny that he might have prompted some faith crises for people. I saw a clip of a stand-up comedian in SLC very recently poking fun at Mormons for believing a salamander led their founder. Fascinating to see how false documents can still affect public discourse. Yeah, they stick around a long time. If you have the link to that, I'd love to see that comedy. I am fascinated by the rise of stand-up comedy within the Mormon tradition. I don't know if you've noticed, there's I forget the name of the comedy club in Salt Lake City that I now follow on Instagram because they have phenomenal comedians using their Mormon past. And it's often, though not always, ex-Mormons talking about Mormonism in a way that explains to the broader world their, tensions and tragedy and trauma that their families are dealing with, which I think is interesting because there is a bit of an ex-evangelical moment in comedy right now with people like Taylor Tomlinson and others using their Netflix specials to dig into their religious trauma. And so it makes sense that Mormons are also partaking in that. And of course, there's also the believing Mormons who are active on the comedy circuit. I think it's Dry Humor. I forget the exact name, but there's some account focused on those type of figures. That's family-friendly comedy. All right. I'm interested in when general authorities call out specific individuals in public, e.g. Elder Holland and the graduation speaker. Did this happen in the history battles you've covered, the mantle and so forth? Not in general conference, but it did happen in several large gatherings and public speeches by church authorities. So for instance, after D. Michael Quinn published his article on post-manifesto polygamy, apparently Boyd K. Packer got up in front of a regional conference and explicitly condemned Quinn for the article, making it clear that Quinn's not going to be a member for much longer. And it was in the wake of that Quinn's stake president was told to remove his temple recommend, which would have meant Quinn losing his job. And so that's one instance. I can't think of any other specifics. In general, church leaders would often specifically speak out against an idea or a tenor or a movement without actually explicitly calling someone out. I'll end on I'll end my answer to this with one note. So I opened this video talking about Boyd K. Packer's famous address, "The Mantle is Far, Far Greater Than the Intellect," which, by the way, it's a great title. It's not just "The Mantle is Far Greater Than the Intellect." You have to throw in that second far. The mantle is far, far greater. That's when you know he's being serious. I had a professor at BYU, I won't out him in case he's not comfortable with it, to where he was reading this in preparation. I was taking a grad seminar while I was an undergrad student on Mormon history, and we were looking at these alternative ways, and that's when I first read that address. And the professor said, "I noticed something when I was recently going through Packer's Mantle address. We often think he's responding to Leonard Arrington or D. Michael Quinn, but he actually laid out the structure and the main points that Packer was making, and they went point for point in rebutting Richard Bushman's earlier essay titled "Believing History" that was published in BYU Studies about 15 years before. So like, we can't be certain, but it at least seems that the target of Packer's address might have actually been Richard Bushman, which is just an interesting note. Kinderhook plates also follow the forgery. Oh, that's a great example for forgery in the 19th century, the Kinderhook plates. Despite having the confession letter from the forger himself, the LDS Church made a deliberate effort in 1962 to restore the Kinderhook as divine. I'm not familiar with the attempt to restore the Kinderhook in 1962. If you have sources on that, I'd love to see it. I thought the church mostly left that behind. And yes, by the way, I have it on my ever-growing list of topics to cover. I have the Kinderhook plates up there, so hopefully we'll do that soon. Oh, I see. The Improvement Era, I should have just kept reading. The Improvement Era 1962 magazine article, "The Kinderhook Plates," written by Welby Ricks, president of University Archaeological Society. Interesting. Thank you so much, Chunky D333. I'm going to go read that as soon as I'm off the thing, although it would be fun to just do a class here. We're going to take a break and read a source together, but I'm going to withstand that and go forward. Speaking of ancient artifacts from the RLDS, what do you think of the Larson daguerreotype? Do you think it's Smith or someone else? What's your thoughts as a historian and as a regular guy? LOL. Thanks for the question. So, how do I phrase this? I'm 52.3% confidence it's Joseph Smith. How's that? No, that's simplifying the whole dynamic. I'll say this. We started earlier about provenance, that there has to be provenance. That's the lesson from the Hoffman forgeries. The provenance is complicated, but viable, because it was in the Smith family. So it's one of these things where we have the provenance, but not the identification. So let me put it this way. If we were to get a daguerreotype of Joseph Smith, this is the way it would have been found. Does that make sense? So like, I'm not saying this is actually a daguerreotype, and maybe I'm down to 47.2% confident that it's actually Joseph. It's, vacillating all the time. But if we were to get a daguerreotype, it would be found through a Smith family descendant within a collection of Smith family records that had not really been engaged. So I'm sympathetic to the argument, and in part because the historians behind it, especially Lachlan Mackay, is a top-notch historian and someone who is not taken by the flimsiest of arguments. He's often the most meticulous and careful of the historians. And the fact that he dug into this, into the records, makes me think that it's at least possible. On the other hand, we don't have the clear document. I will tell you one thing that I don't think proves that it's not. So people often point out, I don't like, when we get out these laser images and we compare and like the nose is a little higher in the cheekbone or whatever. I don't think that's viable because we don't have another viable daguerreotype to compare it to. The painting of Joseph Smith, that the 1842 John Rogers painting that you've seen, there's the one of Joseph and there's the one of Emma that hung in their mansion house. That's a touched up version of Joseph Smith. That's not a realistic depiction. It's what the kids call filters if you're doing Instagram photographs. So I think you can get general ideas, but it's not something where you can get exact measurements. Similarly, the death mask of Joseph Smith is not a fully reliable reconstruction because your face changes after death. The stoppage of the flowing of blood, the settlement for when you're on your back for a while, it's close, but it's not reliable. So Where do I stand? I'm now down to 45.7% confidence, Joseph Smith. How's that? But I will say it's at least plausible. And I hope we have more verification somewhat soon so we can know for sure, one way or the other. Any updates on the Kingdom of Nauvoo production? No, sadly, for those who don't know, I signed my book Kingdom of Nauvoo was optioned for a feature film or dramatic series. There's a team in Hollywood working on a script right now. I know they just finished the project that was in the pipeline before it, which is it's a movie on an early Native American athlete whose name's escaping me. Jesse Owens. Not Jesse Owens. I'm sorry, I forget the name of the athlete. So now they're actually working on it. Hopefully we'll get some updates in the next bit, but I don't know. Viewers, don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you so much. Oh, thanks, Anthony Comedy Church. That's the name of the Salt Lake City venue. While I was an undergrad working at the BYU Special Collections, I remember hearing folklore about silly controversies regarding farms. Something about juvenile acrostic messages in papers. Real? Absolutely. So in response to so there were these wars that took place, ideological wars between Farms, a foundation of ancient research and Mormon studies, a BYU aligned apologetic organization, and what they deemed critics, often people publishing in signature books. And there were some heated reviews. I talked about how Quinn's early Mormonism, the Magic Worldview, was one of the early targets of Farms. One of the other targets was Brent Metcalf, an independent scholar who did important work on the Book of Mormon and early Mormonism. And in response to an article or a book, it might have been the edited book that Brent Metcalf did New Approaches of the Book of Mormon, or it might have just been an article, but there's a long review. And if you were to take the first letter of every paragraph in the review, it was going to say Metcalf is butthead. In the end, someone at the BYU Press recognized what was going on, or at least heard about it, and forced them to change some of it. So some of the few letters got jumbled. But they confessed that, yes, that was Bill Hamblin, who was a BYU history professor. He wanted an acrostic in his review of Metcalf that said Metcalf is butthead. Dry Bar Comedy. Thank you, Jared Whittle. That's the title of trying to do this family-friendly comedy drawing from Mormonism. And Comedy Church, Anthony says, also has believing members. It should be great. I'm going tomorrow night to go watch the comedian. I'm forgetting his name. I'll say it later if it's later. I've really gotten into comedy lately. I think a great subject to study is the whole LDS cinema bubble of the mid-2000s, how it came to be and why it blew out. Oh, heck yes, to use the phrase that they would have used then. The home production era of started out with God's Army. I think that's 2002. Maybe one of the best of the films that was really serious back when Richard Dutcher was a great filmmaker. But then we get the hokey, home, very friendly things like Singles Ward 2, Sons of Provo. So I will say my favorite of all the Mormon cinema back then was, someone in the comments helped me out with the title of the movie. It's about the old rocker. Who was part of New York Dolls. I think New York Doll. I think that's the name of the movie. Phenomenal. Probably my favorite Mormon cinema in the blending of the banal and the sacred in someone's life. So the guitarist of New York Doll converts to Mormonism, is working in their genealogical society, and just the juxtaposition of his life as a rocker in the 70s to working in a genealogical society as a Mormon later on. It's amazing. Why the fall? There wasn't a market for it, right? There ended up being this optimism that people would go out and watch it. And it just turns out there's not enough people willing to go out and watch those films and purchase it. And I think the great sphere of wonderful Mormon filmmakers ended up going in different directions. Richard Dutcher, of course, most prominently took a very different direction. But a lot of the other cinematographers and actors ended up working outside. I mean, I forget the name of the actor who in Singles Ward, but he became a good actor outside of Mormonism. And I think that's common, especially not to, be too introspective and, clinical psychologist here. those of the acting world, of the Hollywood world, the cultural juxtaposition with what they typically believe in and what the church allows is probably not a sustainable tension, which is why many of them ended up finding their success elsewhere. Are there any books that you would recommend that are non-Mormon centric, that do a great job helping us understand the context of the American culture of the early days of the church? I love this question. I often come up with lists of what I call the best books about Mormonism that don't mention Mormonism. Let me give you a few. One, Nathan Hatch, The Democratization of American Christianity, which talked about how both established denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists, as well as new schisms like the Mormons and the Shakers, use the democratized nature of early America to expand this notion of the common man, deifying the individual who might not have credentials, who might not have wealth, who might not have other opportunities. Someone like a plowboy, like Joseph Smith becoming prophet. So I think Nathan Hatch's Democratization of American Christianity is one of the best books to understand early Mormonism that's not about early Mormonism. You can pair that with Amanda Porterfield's book, Conceived in Doubt, which in over-specialized nerd circles is known as the counter hatch, that argued those religions that flourished didn't just embrace democratization or the secularization of the common man and equality, but also instituted structures of submission and authority to pull back to the excesses of liberty that these other religions flourished on, and that you see in Mormon's hierarchical and authoritative structure also represented. So Nathan Hatch's Democratization of American Christianity and Amanda Porterfield's Conceived in Doubt are the two books that represent these competing strains of Mormonism. By the way, I know I'm giving you a lot of hand movements here. It's probably the most common critique I get from people that my hands move too much. I'm sorry. That's just how I operate. I will note you asked about early Mormonism, but I'll give you one book that I think is crucial for understanding modern Mormonism. And that's two books. Kevin Kruse's One Nation Under God, which talks about the birth of Christian libertarianism in post-World War II that fused capitalistic industry and Christian identity into a type of Christian nationalism. You read that book and you're like, oh my heavens, this is Ezra Taft Benson. And yes, Ezra Taft Benson makes a few appearances, but it really unpacks the world and makes you understand the type of Christian nationalism that Mormonism would embrace. And one other book to understand modern Mormonism that doesn't mention Mormonism is Kristen Kobes-Dumay's Jesus and John Wayne, which is one of my favorite books from recent years. Talks about the patriarchal culture of evangelical Christianity in the last few decades. And it brilliantly unpacks this trajectory in which so many people ended up prioritizing their cultural identity over their religious beliefs, which shows how the election of Trump in 2016 was the culmination rather than a rupture of American Christianity. And I think Mormonism fits quite nicely in that story. So there you go. 4 books that will help you understand Mormonism that don't mention Mormonism. And by the way, I was just talking to Kristen Dumay today. She has a book coming out in September or October about a cultural history of live, laugh, love, Christian women and the creation of Christian nationalism. And she has a whole chapter on Mormonism, which I've read, and it's phenomenal. So do your pre-orders right now. And by the way, she's going to join me for a live conversation in the fall to talk about it. So just stay out. Jim Thorpe, Cameron mentioned, yeah, Jim Thorpe. That's the name of the movie that they're coming out. The same production studio that's working on Kingdom of Nauvoo is the one who wrote the upcoming Jim Thorpe movie. Could you regale us? I never turned down the chance to regale with the history and evolution, pre-existence theory, and the war in heaven. Yeah, so this is one of these doctrines that Joseph Smith just kind of lays out these seeds in the book of Abraham and the book of Moses and some portions of his revelations and teachings. But the fleshing out doesn't really come until later. And you end up getting competing views of what the war of heaven and pre-existence actually means. Orson Pratt's vision of pre-existence is different than B.H. Roberts's, and B.H. Roberts's ends up winning the day. I don't know if I have too much more to say about pre-existence, though I will say that they're often drawing from broader cultural myths that they are then Mormonizing through the application of scriptures. Perhaps the topic that many of you think comes to mind with the Mormon pre-existence is the justification for the racial restriction. I will note that nobody connected the pre-existence war to the racial restriction, saying that those of African descent were less valiant in the pre-existence, or they're neutrals in the war in heaven. That idea does not appear until, I believe, the 1890s, decades later, which is an example of how there are these kernels of doctrines in early Mormonism that later get molded into these theological concepts. And so I think that's one notion, but that's a great idea for a topic coming up. So I'll put that on my ever expanding list for videos. Oh yeah, thank you, Bill Gilman, for being a history nerd for 6 months. That's a wonderful achievement. And thank you everyone for who have become members of the channel. I really don't take that for granted. That really is a token of support and help that allows me and Anthony to justify our very busy lives to spend putting these videos together. And so if you want to give back, become a member of the channel. And if you don't want to become a member, totally understandable. I'm not going to judge you, although I will encourage you to at least hit the like button on this video. That's all I ask. I still enjoy the RM. Yeah, that's just, it's a classic movement. The moment where he goes back to the girl's apartment, opens up the blinds, and it's the Salt Lake Temple. That's just, I mean, how do you not love such corny storytelling? Baptist at the barbecue. Oh my gosh, that is a phenomenal, that brings back lots of memories. And by the way, I was invited to give a lecture on Mormonism at Baylor University a couple of years ago. And you bet your bottom line, I opened up speaking at the prominent Baptist university by introducing the audience to Baptists at our barbecue, saying that I felt like this was the reverse. Here was a Mormon at the Baptist University. I don't know if they appreciated the reference, but I certainly got a kick out of it. Kirby Hayborn, yeah, legend from the Mormon cinema days. Best 2 years. Oh, that's a good one. Book of Visions. The book Visions of Glory is central to 3 major crimes by LDS members: murder, kidnapping, child abuse. It's also connected to Kim Ballard. Why does the LDS Church not denounce the book? I believe they did denounce the book, not publicly, but I think they at least sent out a letter to church leaders warning them. But why don't they publicly denounce it? That's a great question, and one that I honestly don't know. They probably should, because that book and Passing the Heavenly Gift by Denver Snuffer are probably 2 of the books, and one, Julie Rowe's book, I forget Julie Rowe's book, are really represent this retrenchment or this cultural populist movement within Mormonism that I think is crucial. I've had Vision of Glory on my mind for a minute, not because I'm converting to that. Don't worry, you guys. But I do want to do a video on it someday. But I want to do it right because it's such a crucial moment in the story. Why doesn't the church publicly denounce it? I think in part because they're terrified of offending so many people who actually love that book and believe that they can square it with their LDS faith. So yeah. And by the way, I am 90% sure that Tom Harrison, the author of the book, or the mediator, if you want to follow the narrative, has commented on my YouTube channel a couple times, which is kind of fun. Sense and Sensibility, another one. Saratov Approach. That's a good one. More recent version of this Mormon cinema that tries to cross over, that kind of downplays its Mormonism. I think that the most recent movie on the German Mormon who was killed by the Nazis is another example of a covert Mormon film that tries to reach a broader audience. What are your thoughts on the continuation of evangelization of Mormonism into mainstream Christianity? I mean, it's a topic on my mind with the church recently introducing a monument with a cross in Temple Square, something that would have been inconceivable a couple decades ago. I mean, I was raised in the LDS church where Gordon Hinckley said that we don't worship a dead Christ, which is why we don't, focus on the cross. We focus on the living Christ, and that the individuals are the monuments of the faith. I think two things are going on. I think there's often a simplification on both sides of this debate. On the one hand, you get plenty of people who are saying that this is purely PR, that the church is trying to buy cultural capital and earn its way into mainstream Christianity and all the benefits that come from that. And I think there's certainly elements of that. I mean, I'm a cultural historian. I've emphasized the way the church has tried to assimilate into American culture. At the same time, there are lots of people who emphasize that this is a sincere move toward a Christian identity, that many people want Mormonism to embrace its Christian connection rather than downplay its uniqueness. I think both things can be true. I think in the case of Russell M. Nelson, he is, on the one hand, genuinely scarred coming to adulthood in the 1960s and 70s when there was an evangelical counter-cult movement that denounced the Mormons as, these cults outside the umbrella of Christianity, trying to prove to them, no, we are Christian, while at the same time being a devout person who wants to embrace a message of peace that's most perfectly captured in the cross. I don't think you can separate those two impulses. The sincere devotion to attach to Christian icons, as well as the pragmatic, one might say opportunistic, use of these icons to earn cultural capital. What about best books not about Mormonism that do mention Mormons? Books about other topics where Mormons are side characters. I love that question. Let me give you at least a couple. One is, I highlighted this in a recent video, Tisa Wenger's new book, Spirits of Empire, about religion and conquest and imperialism in the Midwest, that has a whole chapter on the Mormons in Nauvoo and Missouri and their relations to Native Americans. I think that really places Mormons in a different light as, colonizers, which sometimes takes us out of our vacuum, where we just think the Mormons as victims. What does it mean to look at them as the victimizers, as part of this white Protestant expansion of manifest destiny? So Spirits of Empire is one example. I really liked Adam Jortner's book, Blood from the Sky, about miracles and politics in early America, and how politicians used religion and religion leaders used politics to kind of combat their enemies, breaking down this mythical barrier of church and state to show authority through spiritual and political means. And Joseph Smith and the Mormons show up there. And thankfully, Adam Jortner then used those lessons and wrote a book about the Mormons. Probably my favorite underappreciated book about early Mormonism is Adam Jortner's book, No Place for Saints, which is basically a history of the church through the Zion's camp. That talks about magic. It talks about their conflicts with the neighbors. It talks about the Book of Mormon. It's really, really good. So that's another one. When it comes to 20th century America, let me think. Matthew Sutton's new book, I did a video on this recently on Chosen Land. I thought really succeeded in integrating Mormons into the counter New Deal movement, which in reality is the birth of modern Christian conservatism. And so I think that's a great one. If I think of others, I'll bring them up. Has there been much analysis of the Skousen, McConkie, Fielding Smith era of hyper-literalist interpretation of scripture, aka the Skousen doctrine? Not yet. However, I'm embarking on a project about Cleon Skousen. So hang tight. That's going to be my next focus. Although there has been some really good work. Matthew Bowman wrote a short biography of Joseph Fielding Smith University of Illinois Press has a series titled Short Introduction to Mormon Intellectuals, and Matt Bowman, the Howard W. Hunter Chair of Mormon Studies at Claremont Graduate University, probably the best scholar in Mormon studies, if I'm being honest. He wrote this book on Joseph Fielding Smith, placing him in context of other fundamentalist thinkers in the 20th century. And so I think that would be a great starting point. But no, there hasn't been a great look at how Mormons interpret these scriptures. And it's so crucial because you got me on my soapbox. Because the way that Mormons read scripture in fundamentalist ways is much more recent than you think. It really is born in the mid-20th century, with the three individuals you mentioned, Skousen, McConkie, and Fielding Smith, being crucial to it. And so it's important to recognize that Mormon scripture reading is often culturally influenced, and it's a lot more recent than we assume, which means there are other patterns of hermeneutics in scriptures. So yes, I'm embarking on a project on Cleon Skousen, which means digging into his first 2,000 years, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with his book on the Bible. I believe the first 2,000 years is arguably the most important book on Mormon scriptural reading in the 20th century, because it taught hundreds of thousands of Latter-day Saints to read the Bible in fundamentalist ways. And so here's a pitch. If you attend the Mormon History Association this year, June 3rd through 6th in Las Vegas, I'm fortunate to be the president. This is the seer stone that's given to each incoming president. My presidential address, I'm talking about Cleon Skousen and how he reads scripture into politics and politics into scripture. I'm talking about his two major works, the first 2,000 years about biblical interpretation, and his 5,000-year leap, the book that became a New York Times bestseller when it became the Tea Party movement's favorite textbook on history years after Skousen died. And I'm titling it The 5,000 Years of Cleon Skousen. And I'm going to use Skousen to look at how Mormons interpret these scriptural texts in ways that frame their entire world well beyond just religion. I mean, I learned everything I need to know watching Saturday's Warriors. You joke about Saturday's Warriors. That play and then movie and the soundtrack taught a generation of Latter-day Saints about how to think about the war in heaven, pre-existence, and modern day life. It was, you look at it now, I don't know if any of you have watched it lately. I don't know how nerdy you all are. But like, they specifically talk about the depopulation theory, and they denounce the growing feminist movement. And so Saturday's Warriors, we often think that some of the most influential texts are, general conference sermons or deep scriptural tomes of these books. In reality, most Latter-day Saints learn things through things like Saturday's Warriors. So yeah, I think that play and then movie and soundtrack is far more influential than we'd probably like to admit. When can we look forward to your video on the LDS folklore that is passed down via oral history, photocopies, etc., almost exclusively in missionary apartments around the world? You're speaking my language, Nathan. The deep doctrine binders, the photocopies of photocopies. I think I've found my binder. So I think I'm going to do a video where we just walk through my binder and look at these types of doctrines. And I'm going to ask people to share theirs, because it is such a fascinating topic to learn these under the radar teachings that is just fascinating. When do the stories about modern lives of the three Nephites start? That's a great topic. I once knew this. I took a class on LDS folklore when I was at BYU, taught by Eric Eliason, which was phenomenal. I loved the class. And we read a book on the three Nephites. If I remember correctly, don't quote me on this. In fact, there's a new book that just recently came out on the three Nephites that I recommend checking out. I think it's mostly post-World War II, when three Nephites, where the story's kind of percolated throughout Mormon history, really come into its own. Now, the question is, do these three Nephite stories start appearing because there is a demand for them then, right? lots of people have cars, which means cars are going to break down. There's fears of enemies. There's a need for invisible protection. There's something about post-World War II era that meant people were anxious for the three Nephite stories. Or is it just we were better at recording those stories in the post-World War II era, and they were always in existence? I honestly don't know. I might do a video on the three Nephites, because there's a robust field of Mormon folklore scholarship with people much smarter than me who are digging into this and looking into the sources. And Matt Bowman actually wrote an article once about Mormon folklore of Bigfoot and what that tells us about Mormon culture. And it's a lot more fascinating than you think. For instance, did you know that Bigfoot stopped being black after 1978? I'll let you piece together why that might be. But folklore is often an expression of culture responding to anxieties, answering questions that tell us a lot. And in this rich tradition of Mormon folklore, the three Nephites are often the prominent, the paramount example of these types of tensions. So it's such a fascinating thing. We need a viewing party for all history nerds. Absolutely. What's the history of the treasure guardian being named Nephi until it becomes known as Moroni? I feel you may have addressed this already, not sure. I think I briefly mentioned this in one of my videos where I talk about the early narratives of Joseph Smith's vision, but I haven't focused on it. And I fear I'm going to get something wrong. This is one of those topics where people have strong opinions. And so I worry I might misstate something. And so know that I'll follow this up. I believe Joseph Smith's earliest accounts referred to just an angel. It's not identified. And then Oliver Cowdery's history is the first one that inserts Nephi as the name. But the only accounts that we actually have from Joseph Smith later on have Moroni. Now, is that because Joseph Smith narrated a story to Oliver Cowdery and Oliver Cowdery misremembered and then Joseph Smith then corrected it? Is it because Joseph Smith himself changed the story? I think those are things that are still debated. Again, I don't remember the specific details, but yeah, it's definitely something that I'll return to later. Do you have a sense for whether the LDS church leadership has analyzed the RLDS Community of Christ as a cautionary tale regarding how to walk the tightrope between scholarship and openness with fundamentalism? That's a good question. So I imagine you're meaning it in the sense that and I haven't heard this from LDS leaders, but I certainly hear this from a lot of conservative members of the LDS church and apologists, that our LDS church allowed its historians to start digging into history and accepting secular narratives that undercut their traditional historical claims. That led to an erosion of their theological concepts, a loss of some of their distinctiveness, the changes of certain historic policies, like a Smith member being in charge, an introduction of new matters of inclusion, like women's ordination, and then eventually giving up the name and embracing Community of Christ. And that is therefore a cautionary tale that if you embrace this secularism, if you empower these historians, it's going to lead to the road of liberalization, and you're going to be in worse shape because just look at Community of Christ today, would be the narrative, which I have plenty of Community of Christ friends. Yes, they have dire financial problems, but they emphasize that just because they're small or smaller, just because they're not in great financial shape, does not mean divine disapproval. The Mormon scriptures itself always talk about the few and the faithful, and straight and narrow is the path, yada, yada, yada. But is that narrative used? I imagine it must be in LDS leaders' minds that they worry. Richard Bushman has actually made the argument that LDS leaders are trying to position themselves between what they see as the liberalism of Community of Christ and the outright fundamentalism of fundamentalist Mormons. And they see their way as the moderate middle road. Now, I know many of you are going to be like, LDS church, moderate. In what world? I think in the world, in the mind of many of those LDS leaders, which shows the type of mental space in which they inhabit. Can you discuss how LDS doctrines evolved over time? Things like the light of Christ, baptismal standards, temple worthiness, eternal progression, degrees of glory, proxy baptisms, etc. Great question. Friday's video digs into the evolution of the Mormon doctrine of Godhead during Joseph Smith's era. So I'll just tease that a little bit, and I'll make a note of some of these other topics. Baptismal standards and temple worthiness is definitely a fascinating thing. And degrees of glory, I'll touch on degrees of glory in a minute because that's a fascinating thing. Joseph Smith's doctrine of God. to me, it's clear that it evolves in fundamental ways. In his 14 years from the founding of the Church of Christ in 1830 to his death in 1844. The degree of that change and the nature of those various moments of theological development are still hotly contested by scholars. And so my Friday video, I lay out the key documents, and then I introduce some of the primary interpretive frameworks through which scholars have viewed these documents. The most extreme being that Joseph Smith evolves from a modalist version of God to a Trinitarian to eventually the separate beings of godhood in Nauvoo. I think that's a little overstated, at least in the beginning. I think Joseph Smith was a social Trinitarian, and I'll explain that explanation. I'll explain that definition on Friday. If you're members of the channel, by the way, you already have access to that video. So a big tip if you want to become a member of the channel. Let me talk about one of those other topics you brought up, which is the degrees of glory. We now conceive of the degrees of glory, and I mean we speaking, just of the Mormon tradition, of these three different spheres in which there's no passageways between them, right? You are forever within those spheres of glory. And that's not always been the case. The first edition of James Talmage's Articles of Faith argued that there is literal eternal progression throughout those kingdoms. And that once you reach the highest level of one, you go to the next and onward and onward. That ends up being rejected by the Joseph Fielding Smith wing of Mormonism. And so that's just one example of these key ideas. But yeah, I think I'm going to be doing a series pretty soon on the evolution of doctrines, where I look at some of these specific examples and move one by one. I once read something that Mormon exorcisms kind of died out after the 19th century, too Catholic, and then really picked up after the exorcism came out in the 70s. Thoughts on the current status? That narrative is correct. There's been a number of really good articles on exorcism. Stephen Taysom wrote one. Christopher Blythe wrote one. If you just Google their names and exorcism, you'll find their articles. And the Mormons, like many Catholics and Protestants in America, did have see a resurgence of exorcism after the Exorcist movie. I do a lecture for my university every year on Halloween on the history of witches in America and witchcraft and demonic possession. And I talk about how the Exorcist movie really piqued America's imagination, a fear that the world had become too corporate, that we've lost these spiritual foundations, and therefore we can return to it through, for instance, exorcisms. And so, yeah, I think that narrative is correct. And yeah, the movie The Exorcist. So I really recommend Googling those articles by Stephen Taysom and Christopher Blythe on Mormon exorcism. Thanks, Matthew McKnight, for saying he loves these live streams. So when are you going to write how the rise of communism leads to the rise of Mormon fundamentalism? I already wrote this, bro. Just kidding. That was one of my key arguments in American Zion. This book over my shoulder here is one of the general narratives that the modern church that people have come to recognize for Mormonism was crafted by J. Reuben Clark in response to what he feared were progressivism's inroads, like the Red Scare during the 1930s. And of course, in my next project, where I dig into Cleon Skousen and others, that's going to be a more focused facet of the narrative. But I think that's right, that this creation, I mentioned earlier, books not about Mormonism that tell you a lot about Mormonism, Kevin Kruse's One Nation Under God, that this anti-socialist push, this creation of what Kruse calls Christian libertarianism, is really a response to domestic concerns, FDR's New Deal, as well as global concerns, the Cold War with Russia, and they create a particular Christian identity as a result, and Mormonism is crucial to that. I recently stumbled on the AMC series Hell on Wheels, a fictionalized story of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad at the end of the 19th century. Mormons and Brigham Young feature prominently. If this is the clip I've seen on YouTube, you'll have to correct me in the comments. Is this a clip where there's a Brigham Young and he meets a woman in a town who used to be a Mormon, was now acting as a prostitute. He goes and talks to her and he even takes a cigarette out of her hands and puffs it and tells her, you can still come back to the fold. If that's that series, it looks phenomenal. I thought that was a wonderfully charismatic Brigham Young, because like Brigham Young was such an irreverent, charismatic individual that doesn't really play out. Like one of my beefs with the Netflix series last year, I'm spacing on the name, that was about Mountain Meadows Massacre. They always depict Brigham Young as too Puritan, and Brigham Young was so not Puritan. And so so if that's the series I'm thinking of, I really need to watch it. Angels and Seer Stone Podcast talks about deep doctrine binders and mission folklore. Yeah, absolutely. The Blythes are some of the experts on Mormon folklore. And so I haven't listened to that episode yet, but I'm sure it's great. So I recommend it. Challenging and Testifying Missionary by Alvin Dyer. Great text. Certainly was in my mission binder. I think we read it as a mission district on several occasions. By the way, sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent. There are very few things I get up on my high horse and complain about, young Latter-day Saints having it so much easier than when I was a boy. But this whole encouraging missionaries to fall in love with people on their mission, what the hell is that? I was forced when I was on my LDS mission. I served in Washington, D.C. And I served in a singles ward for a while. We were required to read Lock Your Heart by Spencer W. Kimball every week during our companion study. And now that's not only not required, but it's accepted. That's just what's the world going to, history nerds? I don't understand. Someday we'll be discussing Mormon TikTok influences the way we're talking about Saturday's Warriors today. Any veracity to the rumors that the church is paying social media influencer apologists? So first point, yes, I think social media influencers have so much more influence than is typically assumed, because people's lives are spent online, lots of people. And so I think they're often learning their cues from these people. Is the church paying some social media apologists? In some forms, yeah. I think the church has hired some people over the years. Is it this nefarious cabal of like they're all part of this octopus is the term that was used during the progressive era of condemning like the Standard Oil and other big corporations? I don't think most of the influencers you see online, I doubt those are the influencers being paid by the church. Because when the church pays influencers, they typically have to follow church employment guidelines, which are typically so structured and rigid and boring that it's not very successful. And so I think, yes, there are some influencers that do sponsorships with the church, but I don't think it's nearly as widespread as some might assume, nor do I think the very successful Mormon influencers, even those who are very devout, I don't think they're the ones being paid by the church. All right. One comment about Mary Whitmer's diary entry that describes Nephi. That's interesting. Again, I need to dig into that. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the coil relief mine and how it ties in the broader context of LDS history and U.S. history. For those who aren't aware, the coil relief mine is this mine in Springville, I think, Utah, so southern Utah County, where there was a bishop who claims to have received revelation or a vision that there is gold, minerals, resources, something in Dale. You could tell I'm not an expert on it. I'll need to do some research before I do a video. And so they dig in, and like church leaders get upset with this. They feel like the bishop's being opportunist, although I think there is some early apostolic involvement, but then they pull back. Several of the key people end up being punished, disciplined by the church in some form. But this was back in the 1920s, early 20th century. That mine's still in existence today. There are still devout Mormons who are convinced that eventually they're going to make their grand fortune due to this divinely appointed mine. I have a friend who teaches at BYU, so I'm not going to out him, who is a stockholder. He bought a stock from a fellow ward member, and he'll go and attend their annual meetings and then report back to us on what's going on. And yeah, it's a fascinating story. I think it kind of hits the broader tension, one of the tensions that I think it hits on, is a sense of members trying to tap into this charismatic, miraculous, spiritual nature of Mormonism's past that seems to be lost in the modern corporate culture. And here's a chance to tap in. The same type of thing that goes on in the Denver Snuffer movement, the same type of thing that goes into a number of apocalyptic and fundamentalist groups, just maybe on a much more benign scale, given it's just people, pledging their money. And you know what? If you're going to pledge your money on some failing commercial scheme, at least the dream mine is interesting. Why do members accept the gospel topic essays as the voice of God when they don't have authors or signatures? So on the one thing, I think those essays, most of all, I don't want to paint with a broad brush. Most of those essays were a leaps forward step by the church history department to reckon with difficult issues. It had its roots early on, like I think the earliest meetings where they started talking about it was like in 2005, but it wasn't until 2012, 2013 that the first one came out. And I think there were 13 total. And then there have been like these Q&A pages since then. But they reflect this very awkward space that shows that they did not have universal support among church leaders, which is why they never publicly announced them when they came out, that they just appeared on the website and suddenly the New York Times is breaking the news rather than, the church newsroom. And the fact that so why they don't have names is that's just how the church history department often operates with the supplemental material. That's how the church history department has operated for years. I don't buy into that it's a nefarious trying to, save culpability or complicity to allow this to exist, but in reality, they don't have to, take credit for it. I think that's just how the history department, they want to associate it as a church message rather than an individual author message. Because if you knew that Paul Reeve was the primary author of the Mormonisms and the priesthood restriction, or that Terrell Givens was the primary author on the theosis, or that Patrick Mason was the primary author on violence and peace in Mormonism, I think the church felt like members would see it as less valuable because it's historians writing it rather than the church. I do think it's important. One of the victories for those who want those essays to be integrated is that they are now integrated into Institute lessons and BYU lessons. So all of those who participate in the Global Institute, all of those who go to BYU have to read all those essays as part of their Institute classes, which I think is important. Let's see. Some great discussions on exorcisms. Hell on Wheels, filmed in southern Alberta. Have done any search on Sterling McMurrin, Heber Snell, and McMurrin, and some fascinating battles of Fielding Smith. I had, and I said I'm going to be running out of time, and I see there's a number of more questions. I had a whole sub-theme in my book, American Zion, with Sterling McMurrin, where I used him as a through line across several decades to trace the Mormon dissenter culture. And then sadly, all of that made it on the cutting room floor as I tried to cut down. My first draft of American Zion was about 250,000 words, and I had to cut it down to 150,000 words. So, about over 2/3 of my draft had to be slashed. And sadly, McMurrin was slashed. But he's such a fascinating figure. He was in the church education system before he got his PhD, and then, of course, became one of the most prominent critics. So he shows up in my book, but not nearly as much as I wanted. And yeah, there were some staunch battles with Joseph Fielding Smith. All right, I'm going to go rapid fire on the last question. So let's see if I can make it through. Yes, the Brigham Young was Hell on Wheels. I'm glad I remember that correctly. How much does the LDS church history of changing theology and division of members equates to early Christianity? I think it's a similar dynamic that you have this initial burst of imagination and exploration, and then eventually bureaucratization and the formalization and correlation ends up corralling that into a much more sustained vision. That same dynamic existed in early Christianity. That same dynamic existed in Catholicism. It existed in many of the Protestant sects. And yes, it exists in Mormonism. Anthony Ambrose says he has insights on Mormon social media influencers, so go to him. I attended protests where someone had a sign that said the Mormon pioneers were immigrants, illegal immigrants. How accurate is that statement? So I sympathize with the sentiment because Mormon immigrants were punished and targeted by the institution. Calling them illegal immigrants doesn't really fit because there was not illegal immigration back then. The creation of an illegal immigrant was a creation in the 20th century in response to xenophobia and other matters. And so in some ways as a present day placement on the past, but I still think the sentiment is useful. I love Sterling's story. Anyone know Ben working on a new book? I am working on a book that's going to include Cleon Skousen and the origins of white Christian nationalism in the 20th century. I haven't heard that the Family Proclamation will likely be canonized given the current political social climate. Do you see that as still a possibility, or do you see the church easing on it? I think it's still possible, but I think if it was going to be canonized, it was going to be canonized during Russell Nelson's presidency. And the fact that it has not been canonized yet shows that there is still some opposition within church leadership, because we know there were some church leaders who wanted it canonized. And the fact that it hasn't means that there is some stiff resistance. And so it's still possible. I don't want to get that wrong. It's possible this weekend they will canonize it. But I think every year we go further from this point, the canonization of the Family Proclamation becomes less likely. All right. I think that's all I got. I got a last comment about Catholicism and Christianity, but I don't see much of a question there. So thank you so much. We're at the 90-minute mark. I'm grateful for the many of you who tuned in. This was a lot of fun. Please hit the like button before you go. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't yet. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have given back, please become a member of the channel, which comes with early access to the videos, little icons next to your name. When you saw icons next to people's names here, that's because they're members. And of course, you can feel good knowing that you are supporting public geekery in scholarship. History has never been more relevant than it is in the present. And it's also so rewarding only because I get to geek out with all of you. So thanks to all of you. Enjoy my future videos, and I will see you at the next live video, which will be the first Wednesday of May. Take care, everyone.